Good afternoon. My name is Anne-Marie Dougherty, and I'm the CEO of the Bob Woodruff Foundation. Thank you to our wonderful panelists for joining us, and to our audience for listening in to this timely conversation. For those of you who are tuning in and meeting the Bob Woodruff Foundation for the first time, we've spent the past 15 years investing more than $76 million in creating healthy, positive futures for veterans and their families. We invest time and resources in listening to the military and veteran community so we can understand the most pressing issues they face, then prioritize and help address them. Through our grantees and local partners, we reach over 11 million veterans and families in hundreds of communities all across the country. Today's panel is the second in a three-part series we developed to share knowledge, resources, and best practices to help us collectively tackle the growing crisis of food insecurity in America. Leaders Eat Last is named for the selfless approach of our military leaders who so often put the needs of others before their own. It's an admirable quality in service, but when veterans come home, they shouldn't have to continue to sacrifice when it comes to their well-being. In our first panel, moderated by ABC News correspondent and our co-founder, Bob Woodruff, we focused on defining hunger and food insecurity and examined what food insecurity looks like for veterans and military families. Our expert panelists helped us understand the impact of COVID-19 and the gaps in public programs that have created the urgency for the Bob Woodruff Foundation and our partners to intervene. One concept that really struck me came from Catherine Monet, CEO of the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans. We all know about eviction moratoriums to prevent homelessness. Kathy underscored that there's no hunger moratorium in our country. Families from coast to coast are struggling to eat. Shockingly, that includes not just veterans, but active duty military members. As a philanthropic organization, we'll continue to step in to help catch those who fall through the safety net of public programs. And through our information sharing and conversations like this one, we'll continue to shine a light on current and emerging issues facing our country, our veterans, and their families. Right now, I have the special honor of welcoming back visionary philanthropist, our board member, and my good friend, Craig Newmark, who surprised and delighted everyone during our first panel by announcing that he's investing an additional $15 million in the fight against food insecurity, adding to his initial gift of $10 million. Craig, I am constantly blown away by your generosity and forward thinking. It is my pleasure to thank you for joining us again, and I'll turn it over to you.
Anne-Marie, thanks. I really do appreciate everything that you do. As for me, it's only that a nerd's got to do what a nerd's got to do. First of importance, I'd like to remind everyone in America that we owe vets a great deal. We owe the families of vets a great deal. They give up a lot so that their service member can serve the country. People in our country have been going to bed hungry for way too long. With the pandemic, that's gotten a lot worse, and now it includes a lot of vets and their families and active service members and their families, and that seriously does piss me off. So what I'm doing is I'm working with a lot of people who are actually good at their job, like the Bob Woodruff Foundation and the Got Your Six group and the partners which comprise Got Your Six. They seriously help people put food on their plates today. They seriously help people fill their pantries so they can have a meal tomorrow. And overall, everyone is working on the big changes required to fix our system so that people never have to go hungry. Now, together, we can get this stuff done. What I'm asking of you is to help us get much louder about this, to keep getting louder for an indefinite amount of time about food insecurity, and I want to increase awareness about this outside of our community. Please help boost our message today by sharing what you hear from today's panelists. It's time for me to stop talking. I'm turning it over to Lee Woodruff, who's much smarter than I am. Lee, you're on.
Craig, I don't know about that because I didn't think of Craigslist and you did. So how smart does that make me, right?
The people who use Craigslist thought of it. People had good ideas, emailed them to me. What made sense is what I did.
Well, what we love about you, our lovable nerd, is that you care so deeply about the people in this space. And that's what makes you an extraordinary person, not just to the Bob Woodruff Foundation, but to veterans everywhere. And for all of you who aren't as familiar with the Woodruff Foundation, this is our space. And we started by caring about veterans with traumatic brain injuries. And we, of course, have expanded that to families and caregivers. And Craig has been a supporter almost from the very beginning. And he came to us this year and said, this is unacceptable. We are talking about hunger among veterans who have served their country in 2020 and 2021. And how can we help? And so, Craig, thank you for your big heart, because you're helping us to have some really important conversations like this one. And we have some incredible panelists here to talk about it. So thank you. I'm sending you off with love and hope you're going to stay listening, right? Of course. I like the Wikipedia in the background. He's such a novel guy. We love having him on the veterans team. So with that, I am going to introduce our incredible and esteemed panelists. And we've got a bunch of experts today. You can see them on the screen right now. Let me just do the bio thing where they have to hold their faces in a really awkward position while I read all the fabulous things about them. So Diana Brasto is a registered dietitian nutritionist who comes to us from the VA and the UC Denver School of Medicine, where she studies food insecurity and nutrition in relation to mental health, especially for veterans who have experienced traumatic brain injury, which is something near and dear to my heart. Cindy Leong, assistant professor of nutritional sciences at the University of Michigan School of Public Health, whose research to the Big Blue. That's where my husband went to law school and grew up in Michigan. So go Ann Arbor, go Blue. Yeah, and Dr. Nathaniel Mohat, who, like Diana, works at the VA and also the UC Denver. And also health disparities and equities. So talk about a robust and accomplished panel. Thank you all for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, let's get right down to it. And there are no rules for this discussion because the most boring webinars are those where it's like a total script and everybody has to play their role. So we guys just jump in when you've got something to add or something to say or a provocative good question that I didn't think of, which is probably going to be many. But I want to start by saying that we know that the VA has identified food insecurity as a huge issue. And before I go any further with that, did any of you imagine that we would be in this day and time and place in our world, despite the polarization and despite the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer? Did you ever imagine we would be where we are today?
That's a big
I have an
question.
active imagination, so yes. But go ahead, Nate.
Yeah, I mean, I think that my take is a little bit tainted by growing up in poverty on a reservation and in food insecure living situations and seeing that on a daily basis in my family and in my life. So it's in our country, and it's been in food insecurity and extreme poverty is rampant in our country and has been for a long time.
Yes, and I guess I didn't mean that to sound as naive as it did. I guess that we would not be able to tackle that on a larger scale during a pandemic. That the shocking inability for us during this pandemic to meet those needs at the same level that we're trying to meet testing and vaccinations. I find that shocking. And I love what you just said, because that is a great place to start, that this has always existed, that we've never addressed it fully. And I believe there are many Americans who probably assume that because someone served their country and they have benefits that, they're not going hungry at night. So why don't we start a little bit with that, because what we're really here to talk about is how food insecurity impacts physical and mental health, and of course how it impacts healthcare overall. And don't let me forget before we end with something somebody told me after Bob was injured and I was really at a low point in my life, and it has to do with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where food is one of the critical components. So we'll get to that at the end. But who wants to start? Cindy, why don't we start with you? Tell me how food insecurity affects the diet, well, the physical outcomes of a person.
Yeah, well, there's a long list. We oftentimes think that food insecurity should be a nutritional issue, and to a large extent it is. Food insecurity is associated with eating a poor quality diet, which means fewer fruits and vegetables, fewer whole grains and healthier sources of protein, and more processed foods, more junk foods. And it makes sense because one of the coping strategies that we have for food insecurity is to eat these cheaper, lower quality, widely prevalent foods to help stretch the food budget, which that might mean someone eats cereal for dinner, or someone eats boxed mac and cheese or ramen noodles instead of cooking an actual meal. And this happens before someone starts to even think about skipping a meal or eating less. But over time, these behaviors of eating too much of the wrong foods and not enough of the right ones leads to an onset of a lot of chronic health conditions, things like obesity, hypertension, high cholesterol, diabetes. And it's not surprising that these are the same associations that we see in the research world of being associated with food insecurity. And then if you take that even further, food insecurity is an economic issue, because we know that families who are food insecure, they have higher medical costs because of these health outcomes that are associated, on par of almost $1,900 more per family per year. And at a national level, it's around $77 billion are being spent on healthcare costs that are because of food insecurity. So we think of food insecurity as a nutrition issue, as a health issue, and also as an economic issue.
And just to add to that, there's, at least from what I'm reading and seeing in the news, that those most impacted by COVID and most susceptible to it are all of those risk factors that you just talked about: obesity, diabetes, and everything else. So
absolutely,
that broader picture. Diana, let's talk about mental health and how food insecurity can impact that. Or sometimes is it also the other way around, that mental health then impacts food insecurity? So talk to us about that relationship.
It's really all the data are showing it's a bi-directional relationship. So struggling with your mental health, whether that's something like depression, anxiety, or I would even quantify just high levels of stress in your daily life, that we know those predispose you to becoming food insecure. Whether that's through economic aspects or disability or things like that. We also know it works the other way. Being food insecure makes a person much more likely to develop mental health concerns like depression and anxiety, which makes intuitive sense. If you can't feed yourself, you can't feed your family, or you feel like you are not meeting those needs sufficiently, that can lead to not just a stress in the moment, but kind of a long-term depression. And so they feed each other. And kind of along what Cindy was saying, having a chronic health condition like diabetes can also be associated with having mental health concerns. And so they all kind of feed into this vicious circle. So I'm sick, I can't get food, I feel very down about it, and they just exacerbate each other.
And tangential to that, obviously, is probably homelessness as well in many cases, correct? So it becomes then this spiral of...
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, guess who's up next, Nate? That would be you. And what I wanted to ask, unless you had something to add to that, but I was going to ask you about social determinants of health, but it looked like you maybe wanted to pick up on...
Well, I think that it's actually, it's what I was going to say about social determinants of health, and I've been thinking a lot about, is a perfect segue from what Diana and Cindy were just talking about, actually, and this idea of a vicious cycle. So social determinants, most broadly, we're just talking about any sort of non-medical factors that impact our health. And so the conditions in which we live and grew up in and work in can influence our health. Even more to the point, we know that these social determinants account for, on the high end estimate, about 50% of our health outcomes. So they can be more important than lifestyle choices and healthcare that we receive in terms of determining our health outcomes. And they're all interwoven in these complex relationships where they cause each other and they cause feedback loops as well. And so some of the major social determinants that we think of, food insecurity is right up there. You mentioned another one, homelessness and housing, employment and having income, but then also exposure to traumatic experiences, discrimination, and just systemic poverty in the environment, as well as environmental pollution and risk factors. And they often co-occur, so that our poorest neighborhoods are also those places where people grow up experiencing food insecurity, housing instability, lack of employment opportunities, discrimination, etc. And so the thing, though, is despite this complexity and all these feedback loops, the research that we're learning these days on how this relates, for example, to suicide in military and veteran populations, to get really concrete, is it's additive. Despite the complexity of how they relate to each other, we know that if you have multiple negative social determinants of health, your suicide risk goes up, and it's a linear relationship. It's pretty straightforward. So no exposure to negative social determinants of health, very low risk. If you're exposed to 3, 4, 5, 6 more, they add up. But the inverse is also true. And this is something that I always have to remind myself of, is to not get sort of caught in the pessimism of this and to look at the inverse. So it's not just food insecurity. We can also talk about and measure food security, housing stability, employment. And then we can look at other psychological protective factors like social connectedness and resilience. And when we do that, when we look at it that way, it's also a linear additive relationship. And so as we tack on these protective factors, we increase the likelihood that a person's going to be healthy, and we decrease things like suicide risk and mental health risks. And so one way we can think about tackling this problem and really preventing the negative health outcomes is to think, okay, how do we increase people's access to multiple positive social determinants and protective factors simultaneously?
Can you, all of you guys, can you each weigh in on that? Like, what are, because I want to be somewhat prescriptive here too. What are the ways that, and ultimately we'll get to how can each of us help in our communities too, if you've got thoughts on that. But what are some of the solutions that come to mind?
So speaking just, as a researcher and a clinician in the VA, so the VA has recognized that kind of intersectionality of all these different risk factors. And so in addition to screening for food insecurity, which was instituted a few years ago, and we screened over 6 million veterans at this point, the current practice is to really, if someone screens positive, get them connected, preferably within the day, with not just a dietitian who can help them navigate options for making the most of nutritional assistance dollars for healthy eating, but also with the social worker engaging where they're at, sort of kind of a snapshot mental health wise, because it isn't enough. And I speak from as somebody trained in dietetics, it's, are you eating? Yes or no. Do you have money for food? Yes or no. That doesn't get to the whole story. And really picking apart those nuances. And so they may have a few dollars in their pocket, and so they may say they're not food insecure. But then maybe if you prod a little bit more, it's well, the kids had breakfast and then that kind of hangs in the air. And so it requires more time, but it also means that it really expands the breadth of the services we're able to offer, just in knowing that those are interrelated and following up on that. That's all granted if they come into the VA, which many veterans don't.
And because of that, the VA has been historically focused on improving the clinical care that we provide to veterans. But in recognition that 2/3 of veterans who die by suicide, for example, aren't ever seen in the VA. And what Diana just said, we're starting to do more programs and efforts to collaborate with community services out there. And this is sort of the area where my research and work comes in. What we do is we build prevention programs by creating networks of community services that are working together, that are collaborating, collectively tackling a challenge like suicide or food security, and making sure that our VA clinicians are connected immediately, know how to connect veterans up to diverse services outside the walls of the VA, and that conversely, our community service providers know what we in the VA have to offer veterans and service members.
I'll add that I started this work coming from a food bank background, and I remember in my first week on the job, the director came to me and said, one day, the best day will come when we're all out of work. And clearly that hasn't happened. If anything, in the last year, we've seen food banks really step up and make these heroic efforts to fill the gaps where people are food insecure and need to get food. And I think food insecurity is such a complex social and economic issue. Food banks, food pantries, despite the critical roles that they play, are not going to solve the food insecurity problem. SNAP, our food stamp program, is a wonderful anti-hunger, anti-poverty safety net, but at the same time, it's not going to magically lift millions of Americans out of food insecurity. And so I think it's really important what Nate was describing, these social determinants of health, they coexist. And so we need robust economic policies, food assistance policies, employment, healthcare, all these things that correlate sometimes in the same family, and address all of those in order to really solve the same issues that so many are facing.
Sorry, I was trying to do the right thing as my husband scooted through the back of the room and made noise. So no one heard me. So why don't I? Thank you for telling me I was on mute. So I was gonna. All right. So let me get my thoughts back. Yes, Diana, I wanted to pick up on the whole concept of veterans with mental health issues and what are some of the challenges for them to try to access the kinds of programs that Cindy was just talking about.
Absolutely. So it's not a good joke, but it's my continuing joke during the pandemic is now it's a really good time to be a shut-in, because I expected it to a certain degree, but I've really been struck I've been interviewing some veterans, and I say, how has the pandemic affected, your ability to get food? You're going to the grocery store, and they're like, nothing's changed. I don't go to the grocery store. A lot of them don't, or I only go to the ones that are open late, so I don't have to see people or all of these things. And so it's part of the challenge is a resistance to connection with any kind of organizations, a resistance to being out in the world and being engaged. Of course, I'm generalizing. Not all veterans with mental health issues are in that category, but a lot of them will just, whether it's the VA, whether it's a community organization, they just feel apart from that. They feel like that's not that's not within their world, and so they don't participate. So that's a blockage, that's an obstacle right there. Another one, I know we talk a lot about homelessness. The VA actually has a pretty rigorous homeless system for getting veterans into care and getting them housed with the HUD-VASH program, which is fantastic. And that comes along with a lot of assistance in getting signed up for SNAP or whatever a veteran may qualify for. I think that the trouble is, if you're not in a dire enough situation to be homeless, you can get overlooked because you're still kind of functioning day to day, you're still kind of getting through the day, but you don't really talk about whatever mental health concerns you may have. They may not even show up in a clinical setting because they're not, quote unquote, severe enough, but it's impacting how you take care of yourself. And I see food as really like a form of self-care. And so there's a lot of different angles from which mental health can impact, whether somebody will just outright reject any interactions or whether they'll pull that veteran card, which is, I'm fine, everything's fine. Don't ask me anymore.
So you're making me think of a question, a pullback question that I'd love to ask all three of you. And I guess it has to do with stigma. And I feel like when the wars started in Iraq and Afghanistan, and there's always been stigma around mental health, of course, but I feel like when the wars started, the military and maybe the VA had a little bit of a different approach to mental health than it does now, 13, 14 years later. No one's still screaming from the rooftops, I'm struggling, and someone come help me. The ways in which they cry for help are often painful and final, as Nate, you were speaking about. But have we moved the needle in each one of your eyes? What are we doing to help remove that stigma so someone doesn't feel ashamed, for example, to ask for help or for food or any of the other things that we're failing our veterans on?
Are we moving the needle? We certainly, I think, have made incredible progress as a nation on addressing the stigma of mental illness, at least in the general population. So, 30, 40 years ago, there was, in rural mental health, there was what they called the truck in a parking lot theory, which was that, everybody knows what your pickup truck looks like, and you're not going to park in the parking lot of the mental health center. And so to get around that, they started working in the 90s on integrating behavioral health treatment into primary care offices so that people would feel comfortable going for behavioral health treatment because it looked like they were just at the primary care office or in a strip mall, not necessarily at the mental health center. And so there were some structural changes that occurred, but then a lot of messaging and work. And the thing that I hear when I ask veterans in my research about stigma is, well, we're all, comfortable, at least as veterans. Military is a different context, but in the veteran population, there's a lot more comfort with seeking help for PTSD and depression and mental illness. Stigma is still there. It's not completely gone, but it's something that's at least talked about. But suicide continues to be heavily stigmatized, and that's sort of an area of a lot of work that we need to do. And and it was mentioned on the last panel that stigma is also impacting people's willingness to seek food assistance, which I thought was really interesting. I'd love to hear Diana or Cindy's thoughts on that.
Cindy, go ahead if you.
Yeah, there's definitely really strong stigma attached to being food insecure or using food stamps. I've seen it in children, in parents, in college students. And how do we normalize help seeking so that people are able to use these resources that are for them? That is a question that I still can't answer, but I've talked with teenagers who talk about how they can't invite their friends over because there's no food in the fridge and they don't want to be embarrassed that their friends can't have a snack at their house. I've talked with mothers who are embarrassed to use their food stamp, their EBT card when they shop at the grocery store, and they hide their EBT card in their sleeve when they swipe it so that the grocery store clerk doesn't know that they're using SNAP, or the people on line behind them don't know they're using SNAP and are judging them based on what they're buying. And even when people go to a food pantry or apply for SNAP, we know that they're really food insecure, really severely food insecure at that point. So it's one of the last resources, even though these are supposed to be available for people who need it. And so there's, unfortunately, there's stigma with food insecurity and with using the resources that are supposed to be to prevent food insecurity.
And I would add to that with the military community, and this is just my slice of experience because I do work with post 9/11 veterans, many of them who've had a traumatic brain injury. I'm going to generalize, but they're in their 20s or 30s. Many of them are men, and the need for assistance with food is just so not in alignment with their perceptions of themselves as, I used to be a platoon leader, and now I have headaches all day and I can't get out of bed and I can't even feed myself, and that's not who I'm supposed to be. And so I am not asking for help because that's not how I see myself. It is for some of them, it's anathema. Or what I'm also seeing a lot is if they have some kind of an income, they view themselves as, it's impossible to be food insecure. I have money. And so they tend to really see food insecurity as, you have absolutely not a penny in your pocket. There's nothing in the cupboard. Those people qualify for assistance. If I'm having some trouble, well, that doesn't apply to me. I'm not food insecure. And so even getting them to identify that need within themselves is a challenge.
Wow, that's a lot. That's a lot to take in. And I think you hit on something important as well, which is the shame factor. So take it from stigma to shame. And when you think about your, again, I'm going to overgeneralize here, but your average veteran who is, justifiably proud of their service, of what they've done as a veteran in the military. And for those no longer able, so whether that's traumatic brain injury or other injuries, no longer able to serve, to actively serve, the sense of not being able to feed, take yourself out of it even, but your family, which must be the sort of the higher level of shame. And Nate, I know you see that in Indigenous populations and reservations and things as well. What does that do to, you talked about, the feedback loop on both of these issues, mental health and food insecurity. What does that do to someone's mental health? That sense of shame?
Well, that's exactly right. So stigma is a two-sided coin, right? There's the public stigma, these social norms that we hold that stop people from, wanting to park their truck in the mental health center parking lot or whatever, be seen doing something. They don't want that label attached to them. But the other side of the coin is the internalized stigma. And this is where it gets, so stigma itself is this negative feedback loop. So that those public labels that attach sort of a judgment of somebody being lesser than us, so to say, when you then affiliate with that label, an immense amount of shame comes with that, and that creates another layer of distress. So it's distressing in terms of like, I don't want to go there. I don't want to think about that. I'm not them over there. But then if you are experiencing it, and when you do sort of admit that you need help for something that's stigmatized, that can actually cause even more mental distress if you've internalized that shame and turned it in on yourself. And so we know that it both serves as a barrier to seeking treatment, but then it also serves as a sort of an accelerator of negative health outcomes. So it's a challenge, right? And it's a challenge to mental health. It causes worse mental health outcomes, both by limiting access to care that people need, as well as by causing stress. But the thing that's also challenging here is that, I think Cindy said, how do we address this, right? Mm-hmm. Well, it's something that again, we need to look at the complex relationships in the system. On the one hand, like what is available? How do people get to it? So, thinking creatively about how we can circumnavigate stigma of food assistance, for example. Maybe there's ways to make it so that you don't get affiliated with the negative label, like we did with behavioral health integration into primary care. Maybe there's ways to sort of use CSAs and food delivery programs that look more like a socially desirable thing that you're participating in. So that food assistance then gets sort of affiliated with these socially desirable food-seeking behaviors. But then also you have to change the conversation around the water cooler, right? This is where the rubber really hits the road, is what do people say to each other in social settings? And we can try to address that through media campaigns, but ultimately we need to find those trusted voices in the community and get them to start adopting less stigmatizing language around food assistance, get them to start being willing to talk about things. I think a lot about, 6 or 7 years ago, my wife was diagnosed with cancer, and pretty late stage cancer. And we had massive medical bills, and we lost half of our income all like overnight, right? And like Diana said, I never thought of myself as food insecure or needing help in that way because I had a job. I'm a PhD, I'm a scientist. But the reality was that I did need help. And a friend of mine came to me and said, I want you to apply for this help. We will help you. We will get you help getting food. And it took an immense amount of pressure off of me once those monthly food deliveries came and started helping us until we could get out of that financial situation we were in. Mm-hmm. But I wouldn't have sought that out if it hadn't been for a very supportive social network. So we need that social network that's willing to encourage help seeking.
I would agree with that. The social network, the normalizing of it. So when your wife was struggling with her illness, in my ideal Pollyanna world, there wouldn't even be like, do you qualify for assistance? It's just, you're under a lot of stress. Here's some meals. Here's a lasagna. And so that ties into, we talk a lot about, Cindy said, what can we do? In clinical settings, the VA right now has, I think, over 50 different on-site food banks. That was a response to COVID. But in the long term, we're seeing more and more healthcare organizations do what they call them different things: food prescriptions, food RX, things like that, where again, not even getting into the nitty-gritty of, do you have enough money for food? What's enough money? What kind of food do you need to buy? It's just, oh, you have kidney disease, you have diabetes. Here's a prescription, almost like a medical prescription for a month's supply of fruit and vegetable rich meals. And then it's almost like an on-site pharmacy, or you can call it a food bank or whatever you want to call it. And that's your part of your medicine is that you take home. And you don't bother with what's in your cabinet at home, because it doesn't matter, because this is what you need to be eating for your health right now. And that could take away a lot of the stigma, because you never need to ask the question.
What a great idea. And I was also thinking of another one. You have to live in the right place and have the right climate, but the concept of community gardens and, your ability to almost like, what's it called? I'm forgetting the words, but when everybody shares together, the food co-op. And so if you could come and till the soil a little bit and water something and pull some weeds, then you have access to that, and teaching healthy food and growing things in pots, even at home. And but that's a lot of work, isn't it? When you're talking about something on the scale of the VA and our whole veteran network. A lot of work. Yeah.
I think it's also important to remember, Nate, you alluded to this, that a lot of our veterans live in rural areas where they may already have some kind of gardens, but SNAP benefits or no SNAP benefits, there are no CSAs near them. It's a long drive to any kind of a grocery store. And that's where really telehealth comes in, which has the VA has always been doing it, but it's has really expanded during COVID. And so reaching them and seeing like, what do you need right now? Because signing you up for SNAP benefits that you can't use because there's no grocery store within easy driving distance it's a nice thing to do, but it doesn't really solve anything.
I want to turn back to the kids for a second. Cindy, you touched on it, and I wanted to ask you exclusively about children and the impacts. And your story is sort of heartbreaking about someone who wants to bring a friend home, and there aren't enough, snacks to go around, and so that creates a part of a tear in their social fabric and the way that they approach making friends. Why is it important? Why are children in veteran families? Why is that element even more important to consider, the children in these families in particular?
Well, then it goes beyond the nutrition issue. For children, food insecurity has been associated with academic achievement, with behavioral outcomes, with developmental outcomes, and with mental health outcomes too. So it's going beyond, are they getting enough vitamin C? Are they eating their fruits and vegetables? And from my research, I've done a lot of these really heartbreaking interviews with children just to find out what their own experiences are with food insecurity. For a long time, we thought that parents were doing a really great job at protecting their children from being food insecure. So parents would make sure that they would sacrifice their meals, make sure their children have enough to eat. And more recently, it's coming out that children, despite parents' best intentions, are actually pretty aware of what's happening in the home. They know that their family struggles to get enough food. They know that their parents eat less. And a lot of children actually have their own coping strategies that maybe their parents were even unaware about. So maybe the child eats less so that their mom can eat. Maybe the child eats less or brings home extra snacks from school to give to a younger sibling. And all of this impacts their psychological well-being, right? If they're worrying about whether they're going to have the next meal, if they're worrying about their parents because they look tired from working all the time to get money to put food on the table, it's not surprising then that children who live in food insecure households go on to have a host of poor mental, developmental, behavioral, academic outcomes that are not just linked to inadequate nutrients. And so I think it's important to address food insecurity as a nutritional issue, but also recognize this really strong mental health aspect and how children are psychologically impacted. Stigma we touched on, stress we touched on. Children sometimes feel isolated because they don't want to talk to their parents about it because they know their parents are even more stressed, so they just kind of keep it to themselves. Sometimes they get teased at school for having to buy school lunch while everyone else can buy the fancier food. And children are definitely feeling sad and depressed when we talk to them about their own experiences. And it was really heartbreaking to hear their stories and to hear their coping strategies around food insecurity.
Nate, I wanted to ask you sort of the same question about the work that you do with Indigenous populations. What are you seeing? What are the impacts?
Yeah, so I do suicide prevention in rural and Indigenous communities, and there's just so much diversity within those buckets. It can be hard to generalize, but when we want to start talking about food insecurity and really the broader suite of social determinants in Indian country, we really have to start with history, right? So you have populations and communities that have gone through hundreds of years of settler colonial policies geared towards genocide and limiting their mobility and their opportunity and their wealth. And so you have communities today that are incredibly impoverished and don't have a lot of economic opportunity and don't have the best land. So, for example, the Lakota people who are big in our collective minds in terms of the resistance to colonization, and famous Native Americans like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. They lived a life that was very dependent on the bison herds on the one hand, and they had lots of food from that source, but they also had lots of food because they were able to overpower some smaller tribes that lived on rivers and bring them under their sort of empire or control of the area and gain access to corn and fruits and vegetables. And so they had a robust, well-rounded diet. It wasn't just bison meat. But when we shrunk their land and put them on these little reservations that didn't have much water, let alone fertile riverbeds, didn't have bison herds anymore, we took away their food. Right? I mean, so the food insecurity goes to the heart of colonial history here for a lot of Native American populations. Native Americans, about 1 in 4 experience food insecurity. They're a few statistics, 400% more likely to be food insecure than the general population. 60% of the counties that are majority Native American have severe food shortages. They're food deserts. So we have a major problem in terms of access to food, a major problem in terms of poverty and these intersecting social determinants of health that only exacerbate the problem. The flip side is there's incredible resilience and strength in Native American communities. And more our youth are starting to develop these great programs. For example, there's a nonprofit on the Pine Ridge Reservation that's ranching and herding bison in order to create both opportunities for traditional education and cultural practices as well as food for people. There are suicide prevention programs in Alaska where the people are relearning and tapping into their traditional cultural knowledge around hunting and gathering practices as a form of suicide prevention. And so tying it all together. And so these traditional life ways in Native communities really are a source of strength and opportunity to overcome challenges with all sorts of social determinants of health, including food insecurity.
Those are some good stories. Yeah. And speaking of stories, Diana, you had a story about kids and a breakfast program and veterans program. So can you share that with us?
It's more widespread information now, but so the National Breakfast Program for School Kids was started, I believe, in the 1960s by the Black Panthers in Oakland, California, who saw a need that kids were going to school hungry in parts of Oakland that had just endemic high rates of poverty. And they got a clinical dietitian to design a meal plan. They got donations. They themselves, you can find pictures on the internet of Black Panthers in full regalia with aprons, serving lunches, breakfast, to kids. And so if that's not grassroots, I don't know what is. But in terms of your question about veterans who grew up food insecure, and Cindy, you may know more about this, but in speaking to veterans now who struggle with different mental health issues, this can't all be attributed to food insecurity, but many of them say, I eat the way I eat now because I'm making up for how things used to be. And so a lot of them, if they grew up food insecure, they engage in behaviors that, you can call them disordered, you can call them maladaptive, but there's things like hoarding. There's things like binging. So we also know that eating disorders are much more prevalent, especially among women veterans compared to civilian women. And all of these different things where basically if you grew up food insecure, it's going to color your relationship to food on a lifelong basis, no matter what your food security status is as an adult. You can have all the money in the world and you'll still approach food with this notion of scarcity. It might run out. I don't know if there's going to be more. I'd better get more. for some of them. And for some of them, it's almost like an addiction where it's a socially acceptable addiction, right? I can eat and eat and eat. And it's not viewed the same way as alcohol or illicit substances. And it's not out in the open because it's not what we think of as an eating disorder, which is somebody starving themselves. It's somebody using food to medicate themselves.
And Cindy, you had something, I think, to say about that in terms of food, those changing decision-making for people, the way in which they have access to food. Can you share that with everybody?
Yeah, I want to add on to Diana's point that I think is really important to acknowledge this connection between food insecurity and disordered eating. You know, a lot of times we think of eating disorders targeting a more affluent white female population, and it's certainly, we are seeing food insecure individuals, men, women, and even children exhibit some disordered eating behaviors, potentially due to the fact that they don't have all the foods that they want to eat all the time. And so if you look at this literature on restrained eating or dieting, where someone is kind of self-imposing these restraints on what they can or cannot eat, food insecurity is like that, but it's not yourself imposing those restrictions. It's your economic resources, your community resources that are inflicting those restraints on you. And so that potentially has lifelong implications for someone's relationship with food. My research is now starting to go into the realm of, if food insecurity is stressful, which we know that it is, we know there's something very unique about food insecurity that we perceive to be stressful. It's not the same as housing. It's not the same as, you know, these other bills that we have to pay. But in the parents that I've talked to, they say that food is the one thing that they think about every day, multiple times a day, especially if they have children. And they constantly make these food choices around, what am I going to eat? What am I going to feed my kids? Whereas their rent payments, their car payments, they pay them once a month and they don't think about it until the next month. And so knowing that food insecurity is this constant source of stress, you're worrying all the time about your money running out and whether you're feeding your kids the quality of food that you think they should eat. How does that then change someone's decision-making around food choices when they're shopping in the grocery store, but also just in general around decisions around their health or their childcare or their own health behaviors? So that's a line of research that I'm trying to develop more, because some of these outcomes that we've seen associated with food insecurity are not just a nutrition issue. And so there's a whole robust literature in health psychology around stress and how stress changes the way we make decisions, specifically around food. We know that when we're stressed, we tend to reach for foods that are highly palatable, foods that are high in sugar, high in salt, high fat, the chips, the ice cream, the pizzas, because they taste good and they help our stress. They make us feel better. So is stress then part of the reasons why we're seeing these negative health outcomes? And if so, how do we then incorporate stress reduction or just more mental health preservation into our traditional food assistance programs, which currently don't really address it? They really just say, here's a card, go buy some food.
Yeah. Right. We're coming up on our hour, and I want to get to Meg Harrell, our incredible director of grants. In just a sec, is there a very quick way in which each of you guys could talk about what is it that each one of us, everybody listening today and right now, and all the people that will view this later, we all can play a role in some way here? What advice do you, all three of you, have for how we can impact this? These are our communities too.
I'll start. I'll say, talk to people, listen to their stories, and try to amplify their voices the best ways that we can through our different outlets. Everyone has a different story to tell. Food insecurity is not a homogeneous experience. People experience it or become food insecure for a lot of reasons, and people manage it with a lot of different strategies. And a lot of that struggle is invisible. And so talk to people, ask them questions, and just listen. And I think that is the best way to identifying how then do we solve food insecurity is listening to the people who actually experience it.
I'll tie into that and say it's with so many people now struggling with all kinds of socioeconomic issues and unemployment and all of that, that's really, I hate to say it's a silver lining of COVID, because I think it's being an overused statement these days, but it is a silver lining, is that it's really affected so many people. And so kind of along the lines of not, do you have money for food, but what did you eat today? Can I bring you a sandwich? And it's viewing it again as this sort of self-care, we care for each other. You're struggling with something. Do you need laundry done or a meal, and kind of packaging it in all these other aspects of getting your needs met, and not singling it out as, do you have this problem, this one problem that no one likes to talk about? And it's just, no, it's a problem with all the other problems. So let's address them all kind of simultaneously. That's
a really smart idea. Just sort of flatline everything and make it all of equal value. In terms of how can I help? Nate, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I would add to that again. It sort of gets back to what I was saying about stigma. You know, if we can normalize these conversations and normalize seeking help for something that a lot of us experience, and if we haven't experienced it ourselves, maybe someone we know has. And so there's lots of ways that we can talk to each other and about this issue, and encourage people to seek help. You know, the other piece of the puzzle is what Cindy was also talking about, which is it's not just about getting food to people, right? We do need to think about how the different types of social and healthcare services work together to tackle this problem and all the related problems. And so we want to make sure that we're bringing our community systems together really to work collaboratively on food security, not just as a food issue, but also as a health issue, as a financial issue, and as a mental health issue.
That's a great place to pause. I promised I would quickly share my story, which is really simple. And it was a psychiatrist who told me this when I was going through the post sort of trauma of Bob, who was getting better, but I had 4 small children. And he said, when you wake up at 3:30 in the morning and you're, completely birds are flying at your head, ask yourself these questions. Do you have a roof over your head? Yes. Do you have enough to eat? Yes. Do you have people that love you? Yeah. Do you have people that you love? I do. Well, then go back to bed, he said, and it always looks better in the morning. But I am always struck when I share that with someone that I am in a very privileged place to have enough food to eat and to have a roof over my head. And so we're talking today about a vast number of people among our veteran population who can't say all that and have all that stress on top of it as well. And you all have done a wonderful job of outlining the stressors and just the everyday life. Take COVID out of it. So I want to, before I turn it over to Meg, thank you all for really beautifully outlining not just the issues in ways that I hadn't thought about, but ways in which we can all think about moving through the world. So with that, Meg Harrell needs no introduction. She's bulletproof. She's the woman who single-handedly took our granting program when COVID hit and said, guess what we're going to do? We're going to feed people. So without another word from my mouth, Meg, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Lee. And thank you to our esteemed panelists for helping us to understand that food insecurity really is more than a food issue. And also, thank you to Craig Newmark for your incredibly generous support to enable all of this work. I'm Meg Harrell. I'm the Chief Program Officer of the Bob Woodruff Foundation. We're very pleased to bring the second panel of our Leaders Eat Last discussion series to you, and we're thrilled that so many of you joined us today. Thank you for your time and your attention to this very important issue. In our first panel last month, we heard about the disturbingly high prevalence of food insecurity in the military and veteran community. Today, we heard about the secondary implications of food insecurity and that our nation spends $77 billion on healthcare related to food insecurity. We heard that food insecurity and especially mental health feed each other, and about the relationship between stress, food insecurity, eating decisions, and broader health outcomes. And I know that my heart is not the only one that broke with Cindy's discussion of the long-term impact of food insecurity on our children. And thank you, Nate. You generously illustrated with your own personal experience that food insecurity can happen to anyone, regardless of employment and education level even. So the Bob Woodruff Foundation finds, funds, shapes, and accelerates best-in-class programs to ensure that military and veteran families thrive. We're steadfast in our enduring commitment to meet the needs of this population over time as they evolve. We're currently granting to organizations addressing food insecurity in our military and veteran population, and the lessons from this Leaders Eat Last series is informing those grants. With the very generous support from Craig, we're doing all that we can to address and eradicate food insecurity in the military and veteran community. We're granting across the spectrum of full plate, providing meals, full pantry, helping families so they never have to choose between paying rent or filling their pantry, and also full coverage to help resolve the systemic challenges that create food insecurity. And also thanks to Craig's generosity, we recently provided $500,000 to our network of local partners to combat food insecurity. But that insecurity and the secondary health effects discussed today still continue. And with that in mind, I'm pleased to announce that we're initiating another round of food insecurity funding for our local partners. So to those communities who partner with the Bob Woodruff Foundation, please let us help you. We've got your six. Until, as Cindy said, the best day comes and we're all out of work. Thank you for joining us today. Please stay tuned for more information about our third segment of Leaders Eat Last, to be hosted by Martha Raditz.